But one of my biggest reasons for doing this class is I want to encourage people to do fall gardens. I think that it is a great opportunity. It sometimes is missed. And in some instances, it may actually be a better time of year to garden for some vegetables than earlier in the season. And so we'll talk about that some as I go along. So if I do mention any trade names during tonight's presentation, please understand it's just for communication purposes. Neither myself nor the university are endorsing any products, and certainly there are other products that may be available and suitable, and so it wouldn't be an exclusionary thing of them either. So just be aware of that. We don't endorse products. So of course, one question you might have if you're new to gardening, or what my interpretation of it is, what is a fall garden? And so for me, this is just a garden that extends the growing and harvest season past summer. So, the key about it though is we kind of start this time of year and to enable that fall harvest. So it's a way to extend our harvest in the garden. We could almost view this as solely a succession planting, meaning we can plant the same crop or the same vegetable multiple times in the garden just to extend that harvest period. So we could look at it in only that light, but I think it's more than that as well. I also don't want to default into, and I know that some of the pictures I have in here are kind of our typical fall crops, like the brassicas of cabbage and broccoli, but that's not the only things we can grow as fall crops. And so it's not just a mirror of our cool season or spring gardens. It actually can be a lot more than just those cool season crops. And I think sometimes that's what surprises people. So one of the big handouts, or if you're in person, that's here, but also it'll be on your list, is this one here, and it's garden planning, plant preparation, and planting. And the last page of this document is actually a table that shows planting dates. And you'll see it there, and I actually have it blown up on the next slide, so we might be able to see it a little bit better. And so you can see the information there. It's very basic, but good information for us. It's got a column for spring planting dates, fall planting dates, and then spacing and some required amounts of seed or plants per 100-foot row. And so good information. What I want to focus on is the column, the third one, that's our fall planting date. So this publication, if you attended any of the earlier vegetable gardening classes I had, we were looking at, the planting dates from a spring or main season perspective. And I told you then, remember that range there, that date range is actually for the entire state. And what that means functionally is that we have to estimate where we fall in that range. So in spring, sometimes we have to wait towards the latter half of it before we plant, because, for instance, Memphis is going to be warmer than we are on, March 15th. With the fall planting that we're focusing on now, we kind of do a little bit of the opposite. We want to be sort of towards the first half of the planting period, in order to capture enough heat during those later days to do well. So we cool off sooner than Memphis does in September, for instance. So we do want to look at, these are estimates. I have planted outside of some of these estimates, but this is a great resource to look at. There will be some things that are not recommended for fall planting, and you see a blank space there. By and large, those are warm season crops that are frost sensitive, that have a very long period until harvest, or at least a longer period than a lot of our other crops in the garden. So you'll see their eggplant, for instance, and muskmelon and peppers aren't typically regarded as a fall crop. So we probably don't want to see those in the garden. But I will say this, peas are one that you can find reports of gardeners doing it. I think it depends on the season in our area. We can still be very warm in the late summer, early fall period, and that's a challenge for peas. So it's a question mark for me. If you want to try peas in the fall garden, I think there's certainly nothing wrong with that. And certain peas can even overwinter in our area with success. But it may be a challenge if we try to do it in the fall garden. So that might be a question mark, but it might be one you want to experiment with in your own garden. So just remember, That range in the fall column, we probably want to be on the first half in general for planting things. And again, this is not exact. We can plant later and have good results. I like a fall vegetable garden because really for me, it's kind of a second opportunity or maybe a third. If you do a great job doing an early cool season garden, we've kind of got 3 vegetable growing periods in Tennessee. We've got the early spring cool season crops. We've got our main summer crops. And then we have the fall garden, which is actually kind of a mix of both. And so it's a great opportunity if you didn't have the success you wanted, or maybe you had limited space and time. So, you know, if you didn't get to plant everything you wanted to in the spring or in the summer, or if you knew you weren't going to be able to take care of it, so you didn't plant it, extending that season until we get to frost is a great way to look at enjoying your garden more. And certainly this year we've had some dry periods. We've definitely had some wet periods, depending where you're at. Some of the latest showers and everything have been very spotty. I live up in Sullivan County. And when Jonesboro was getting some tremendous amounts of rain recently, we were getting very little. So it is something that can be variable across the county and certainly across the region. But the other thing I like about vegetable gardens in the fall is we still have that option. If we want to grow a large number of something, we have the ability to preserve it. If we want to do just fresh eating, just a little bit of many different things, that's great too. If you've ever tried to store potatoes over winter, if you got disgusted about how short their life was in storage, look at doing potatoes as a fall garden crop. Because to get that extended storage life, we basically want to cut the amount of time we have them in storage. So planting about the middle of this month is kind of about the latest, but if you did it really quick, I think you'd still be okay. But that can give you a potato that actually stores longer in your home storage simply because it's younger. It hasn't been there as long. So we always think of potatoes as being that spring crop, and certainly they do great, but they also can do well as that fall crop. Some basic things before we start. I hope as the season goes along, you've been pulling plants once they either start to go to flower, if there's something cool season that we don't normally want flowering. So, you know, as lettuce bolts or as broccoli bolts, you go ahead and pull those plants out of the garden, because I don't want plants that aren't productive to be in the garden as a nursery for insects or diseases. So if you've been doing that all along, sanitation at this point shouldn't take very long, but basically as crops begin to not be productive, remove them. Pay attention to what was planted where. So I always encourage gardeners to think about doing a written plan because we would like to rotate crops among families, because plant families will have shared diseases and insects as well as nutritional needs. So by varying what's planted where, we can sometimes benefit ourselves in our garden. So for instance, we wouldn't want to plant peppers where we had tomatoes because they're both in the Solanaceae family. But just something to pay attention to, and it can be helpful to help minimize some pest problems in the garden. Ideally, you'd rotate away, 3 years or longer. Realistically, even if you can just do it 1 year, that's good. The other thing we want to consider is fertility. So if we did fertilization in our gardens at the beginning of the season, and even if we've come back and done some side dressing or mid-season application of nitrogen, like with tomatoes, when we first saw those first tomatoes get about 1 inch in size, we probably want to think about adding some more fertility if we're going to be planting new crops in there, because every harvest we make out of the garden is removing fertility. It's removing those nutrients. And so we don't want to be in a situation where we're only having nutrients go one direction. So if it's fertilizer, compost, whatever you prefer to use, it's a good idea to go ahead and do that. I still like the general rule that we use in the spring of 2 pounds of actual nitrogen fertilizer per 1,000 square feet. And again, the exact amount of fertilizer you use depends on the rate or the percentage or content of the fertilizer. So for a triple 10 product that has 10% nitrogen in it, we'd apply 20 pounds over 1,000 square feet. So it does depend on what product you use, how much fertilizer you apply, but we're looking for 2 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. I want to encourage you to consider what you're going to do about water with your fall garden. because as I said earlier, we kind of start in the heat of summer with it. And because of that, we certainly have higher temperatures. Depending on the year, we can have very dry conditions. And so having the ability early on with a fall garden to actually do some irrigation is going to be beneficial. And so, that can be, whether it's a hose or whatever works for your situation, the ability to irrigate is actually going to make you more successful. It's going to benefit those plants early on when it's hotter. The other thing is even October. We don't normally think at October being necessarily the hottest, but Octobers are not uncommon to be a little bit on the dry side. It's not one of our rainiest months. So even later in the season, we can still benefit by having that ability to do some irrigation. We like to water or irrigate infrequently, but deeply. So that means rather than just wetting the surface every single day, we'd like to have that water going down several inches. That's going to encourage those roots to go deeper. And that's how we get a plant that's deeply rooted and better able to deal with short periods when maybe there isn't sufficient water and you're not able to irrigate. Still like the use of mulches in the garden. Things like straw, I really like. Compost can even be used as a mulch, but sometimes we gotta be careful because that can be a great place for weed seeds to grow if they blow in. So just pay attention to that. Don't let that get out of hand. Wood chips are fine for the garden, but if you till them in, it can create some problems. So wood chips are not something I would say use if you plan on tilling in your garden at the end of the season, because as we add a lot of that wood to the soil, we can start limiting nitrogen availability. And so we don't lose it, it'll come back, but it can tie it up and make it unavailable for plants for a while. The other thing, even in a raised bed, if you're not tilling or using equipment, if you are digging a lot in a raised bed, planting things, especially if you use your hands a lot, you don't want to mix those wood chips into the soil because that makes it a pain to dig through the soil with your hands. So if you do use wood chips, just do your best not to mix those into the soil. Keep them on the surface and they work great and do well. Seeds or transplants, we have the options depending on what we're talking about to possibly transplant it. So generally those things that take longer in the garden, we're going to recommend that you do transplant. It's going to get us a mature plant faster. That's why we do it in the spring. It's why we want to do it again in the fall, because we want to make sure we have enough time there. Short season things, which is a number of what we grow in the fall garden. And again, that one chart that I showed earlier from the publication, that one's a great thing to reference because it tells you seed or transplants that you're using. So it's a good reference to make a decision. Short season things we do well from seed. The other thing is, if you're on the bubble of should you or should you not, sometimes just going ahead and doing it will get us a good result. One thing I wanted to bring up real quick is tomato transplants. So if you go looking for tomato transplants this time of year, you're probably not going to find a lot. Most stores have not maintained or brought in new transplants. So what you do find may not be the prettiest, nicest ones anyway. There's a quick, easy way to have your own transplants pretty quickly, and that's to root tomato suckers. So normally when we talk about suckers, we're talking about indeterminate tomato plants, those that keep growing and growing. And the suckers are the adventitious branches we get occurring on the plant. And so the rule of thumb is early on with those, we will leave one sucker below the first fruit cluster or flower cluster, and then we remove those further down. And what this does, it helps focus some of the energy into fruit production rather than growing more plant. Generally, as the season goes on, we don't pay a lot of attention to it. It can be useful to sucker a plant later, especially if you're trying to keep it contained in an area, especially for indeterminates. Determinates, we typically don't sucker. They don't require it. They are much more manageable in size. They don't keep growing and growing. But we can take these suckers, and if we just place them in tap water, it doesn't have to be anything special. We don't need rooting hormone or anything like that. In just a few days' time, we are going to have roots showing up on those suckers. And then we can either pot those up into a small container to let them grow a little bit before we put them out, or we can go ahead and put them out in the garden. I probably wouldn't advise you put them directly out in straight full sun immediately. So if you've got a garden situation where you've got an area that maybe has a little bit of shade, or you've got some tall things in the garden they can go beside that will give them a little bit of shade, that can be a good scenario. Otherwise, you can pot them up, let them grow into size before you ultimately transplant them out. What's really interesting about these is because these have been on a plant, because they're older, even though they're small in size, they're going to start fruiting faster than what we see from a seed grown transplant. So these will actually get to fruit faster than if you planted a transplant from seed of equal size at the same time. And so with the fall garden, with warm season things, the quicker we can get them to fruit, the better. So this is a great way to do it. So if you have healthy tomato plants, if you have a neighbor that's got some tomato plants and you really liked what they had, this can be a great way to get a free plant that's going to grow well and do well for the garden. For me, the biggest consideration with the fall garden is the time. How much growing season is left, or how many days to harvest does a particular vegetable require? And it's all in reference really to the expected first frost date. So this is always just an estimate, but in our area, around October 15th, 18th, somewhere in that time frame is generally when we see our first frost. It doesn't mean we can't have weather after that. It's conducive to our garden growing, but that's about when we typically see the first frost of the season. And so certainly for our warm season crops, we want to pay real close attention to that date. So what is a frost? Basically, it's a frozen form of dew. You have conditions that allow dew to form. The water vapor condenses on a surface. The surface itself has actually reached 32 degrees Fahrenheit, so it will freeze to ice the water, but the air temperature is warmer. So, we often see frost on our windshields, on our roofs, or even on our lawns and other plants. And those ice crystals cause damage. It can actually rupture cells and really cause a lot of damage. So oftentimes after we have a frost, you will see that foliage, for instance, will look water soaked or dark. And that's literally from the burst cells. And we do know from experience that plants have different degrees of sensitivity to frost. We also see differences in the landscape. So it's not a coincidence that we often find orchards planted on hillsides. We do that purposely because cold air moves like water. It moves downhill. And so from a valley to a hillside, you can sometimes get a degree or two difference in temperature. And at the right time, particularly in the spring, when we have flowers present, that couple of degrees difference can very well mean the difference between a significant loss of the fruit crop or survival. The thing to be aware of, though, is we can create impediments to that flow of cool air in our hilly geography and create frost pockets. So here you see it depicted as if we have a heavy vegetative growth in place, but this can happen with buildings as well. So just be aware if you have some topography that is hilly, we may have a frost pocket, or we may have a good way for frost to drain away. So we can sometimes avoid a frost. So just be aware of how frost works in the landscape. So touching back on the variability of tolerance. So again, our warm season stuff, all those things we wait until May, or we should wait until May before we plant, they're going to be intolerant to frost. So warm season, you'll not find them listed here. But those that can handle light frost, you can see quite a few there, including things like broccoli and cauliflower that are traditionally cool season crops, as well as turnips and Swiss chard. We actually have some that can tolerate freezes in the high 20s. So things like beets, green onions, peas, and radishes are all ones that can tolerate a freeze decently well. And I will say too, this spring, we had some spring gardens planted at some schools, and we had some radishes and we had some different lettuces, and some of the lettuces actually did better than our radishes. So I think we do have some lettuces that are particularly maybe a little bit more tolerant. Black-seeded Simpson, which is an old lettuce, nothing new at all, but it seemed to do really well. It held up very well. So I was impressed by that. But then we have kind of the champions of cold weather. And these are the ones that can take an absolute hard freeze once we get down into the lower 20s. Things like Brussels sprouts, collard greens, as well as kale are all extremely tolerant of low temperatures. Now, it doesn't mean we can't kill them with a freeze. Absolutely, we can. But they are going to be our most cold hardy. So when other things stop or even killed by cold weather, things like collard greens and kale can keep going.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
The days in parentheses, is that?
That is an estimated days to harvest.
Okay.
So from seed where appropriate or from transplant where appropriate, that's how many days to harvest. And again, you see it's a range. Depending on the variety you choose, you're going to be on either end of that range. So it's just an estimate, but it gives you an idea. And so you can see some of those things like kale that are very hard freeze tolerant, they're also rather short. And so that means we can plant them pretty late and still be okay. So let's see here. So this is just an example of a fall garden we did at a school. We planted things later than we would like. I would never suggest that you plant your fall garden this late. And so we had a number of different things in there: kale and cabbage and kohlrabi, Chinese cabbage, some Swiss chard. And we planted it basically middle of September. We would have liked to have been 2 weeks earlier, but sometimes timing doesn't work out the way you want. And so you can see the progression there. A little bit later in September, we had good growth. These were being watered, so this wasn't just precipitation. And then as we go later into October, you can see significant amount of growth. You see less and less of that potting mix there in the raised bed. And then ultimately we get to almost the end of October and we see tremendous amounts of growth. And so this is why we're able, and you can see there on the corner and the like right front corner there, we see some Swiss chard growing. We see kale kind of overtaking a lot. A lot of things did really well that year. And this is not unusual. Our fall school gardens typically do fairly well. I actually like the fall gardens better than the spring gardens because it's easier to make it look good. And it makes me look good. So, but it is something that, you know, and you're probably thinking, well, that's a lot of leafy stuff. And it is a lot of our best fall materials are more leafy type things. But we can also, if we get started earlier, have some of those warm season things. So things like tomatoes, if we get them in the ground very soon, we'll be okay. We'll be able to get a second crop because, you know, indeterminate tomatoes, technically speaking, you plant them and they'll keep growing until frost, basically, unless you have all the diseases and things that happen along the way. So in our region, it's very rare, I would say, to have those tomatoes last from planting in May all the way to frost. It's just they succumb to all the pests that are out there. And so oftentimes when they start getting a little haggard, when they start getting non-productive, that's when we can come in and have that second planting coming on. So that's why I encourage you to look at the warm season. We are getting on the cusp of not being good timing on some of those, depending on which one we're talking about, but it's probably still worth the effort.
Real quick.
Sure.
Was that garden over at Market?
No, that was actually at Sulphur Springs. That one was at Sulphur Springs. Yeah. So days to harvest, and we can find this referenced as days to maturity, but basically that's how quickly should we expect to get a harvest. Obviously, leafy things is shorter than things that make fruit. We find this information on seed packets or on tags if we're buying plants. You can literally find, you know, again, 3 weeks difference between different cultivars of the same thing. So in the fall, I really like you to look at the shorter ones, because if we have an early winter, if we have a lot of cooler temperatures, the fewer days it takes to reach harvest, the quicker we're going to get that harvest. And so that can be a real benefit to us. And just keep in mind, it's not an absolute. It doesn't mean if we plant it, then exactly at day 50, we will get the harvest, but it is a good comparison between different varieties. And certainly weather, cooler or warmer, will speed up or slow that down. We do look at those dates based on how we typically use them in the garden. So seeded things are from a direct seeded date. or maybe allowing a few days for germination. But for those things that we transplant, and particularly with things like the fall garden, broccoli and cabbage and things of that nature, it would most definitely be a transplant date. So understand that. And generally speaking, we want 4 to 6 weeks to grow a transplant. So if we're talking about doing broccoli or cabbage, we need to really quickly get those transplants started, or make sure we can buy them from somewhere. One thing we can do is just use the chart, and it's the easy, simple way, but I wanted to walk through a little bit how they came up with those dates, because sometimes what you're wanting to grow may not be on there, or you wonder, well, if this is significantly more or less than the standard, days to harvest, how would I go about figuring out when to plant it? So this is just, we'll assume the harvest bell curve. So we'll assume it's normal distribution. Basically, we get a harvest of whatever we're growing. It starts off slow, it peaks, it starts slowing down until it's done. So basically, we see this a lot in the garden if something doesn't die due to disease or insects. So let's say the red line represents when we get the frost. So in this particular case, if we get the frost there, we got very little harvest off of that. We lost a lot of potential harvest. And so if we calculate, or if we use that chart, what we do is we just move the the frost to there. And now suddenly we've got the majority of the harvest possible off of those plants. And so this is why we look at when do we actually plant, because I would much rather spend the time and effort of planting something and growing it and getting this much harvest as opposed to the slide we just saw where we got very little. Because the difference really is timing. It's not the effort, it's just the timing of our effort. And so this is why figuring out when to plant is important. The chart is great, it's easy, but we can also, again, do some things by hand and actually figure this out. So with warm season crops, these are, again, those things we plant earlier in the season, like in May. We wait till things warm up. We know, one, as a general rule, biological and chemical reactions slow down as temperature drops. So that means when we look at these crops, we're going to anticipate they're not going to grow as fast as they did during summer. So that days to maturity, that was an estimate, we're going to say it takes longer. And so basically what we can do is if we've got a frost sensitive warm season crop, we can actually add or subtract, however you want to think about it, 14 days because we want a buffer there. What if it's an early frost? If our average is the 18th, what if it's a week early? Well, so if we actually pretend that that first frost date is about October 4th or something like that to give us a little buffer just in case. And then because we know things grow slower as they get cooler and as our days are getting a little shorter, we might actually say, okay, we're going to pretend it takes 10 days longer for this to actually reach harvest. Because again, that number was just an estimate. So what that means functionally is warm season crops add 24 days to the days of maturity estimate. And then you count backwards from your first frost. Cool season crops, those things that are at least frost tolerant, we've got a couple of options we can do. We can just say, okay, we want to start getting the first harvest around the first frost date. Nothing wrong with that. It's not going to be bothered by that frost. It'll keep going after it. Or we can adjust it by a couple of weeks just so we get a little more harvest earlier. Really just depends what you want. Although we have colder temperatures, it does mean slower growth. We are also talking about crops that are preferably growing when it's cool. So we'll talk about an example here in just a second. So here's a warm season one that can work well in our gardens. It's about 50 days to harvest. If we look at the reference information, is definitely frost sensitive, yellow squash. And so by adding that 24 days to the 50 days, we get about 74 days before frost would be the latest we would want to plant. And so if we assume about October 15th is our last frost, or excuse me, first frost, not last frost, that's a typo. And we have basically the end result of around August 5th for planting. If we were going to be direct seeds, look maybe to the last week of July, just to give them a few days to pop up. And if we actually go and look to our reference, we see there they have that basically the month range of somewhere from July to August. I have found that I think that publication is a little bit conservative in their estimate, which is good. That means we're more likely to be successful. But you can see we actually kind of fall in that range. If we were transplanting, I say about the first week of August versus what they're saying is the very first of August. So again, I think they're a little bit more conservative, which it's not wrong to be conservative with a fall garden. That sometimes can really pay off. So again, the chart is a great reference. Let's say we have a crop like broccoli that is frost tolerant. It's not going to be worried about a frost. It'll still keep growing. So depending when we want to do it, we can either move that estimated number of days forward or not. And we really don't have to worry about adding days because it's cooler, because these are crops that actually like the cool weather. So they'll keep right on trucking through. So broccoli, depending on what variety, is about 65 days from transplant. If we look at, okay, I don't care, I don't really want it in the middle of October. I want it later in the month. So we can actually say, well, let's go past that frost date and maybe estimate we're going to get a harvest about November 1st. So 65 days from November 1st is about August 30th. And again, we have that date reference there of basically the month of August. So again, ideally, I'd tell you look about the middle or so for our area, or a little bit earlier. Certainly, if you're joining us from Johnson County, I'd probably say a little bit earlier with the higher elevations. You're going to see a frost coming sooner. But again, their estimate is slightly more conservative than the calculated, which means it's a good one to go with. We're not going to get disappointed by using that estimate. So what if we are a few days past ideal? I mean, again, we planted those school gardens really 2 weeks later than I probably would have liked to. I'm going to still tell you to try it, because depending on the season, I have had tomatoes that were alive. Now, granted, they weren't growing much, but at Thanksgiving, it can happen. So it's not an absolute requirement that everything's going to stop October 15th or 18th. But again, it's up to you. It all comes down to what are you willing to risk? And to me, what we're risking in the garden is generally not a lot of money. It's just a little bit for plants or seeds. And sometimes we get really lucky and we can really extend that harvest later. The other thing we can do is we can be a little more dramatic with our fall garden and do something to actually change things in our favor. And that's doing some modifications to extend that season. So floating row covers, sometimes we use these during the main season for insect control to keep basically insects from reaching our plants. They're lightweight fabric. There are different weights available to them, and those also have different amounts of light transmission. So not surprising, the heavier weighted fabrics don't let as much light through. But we can use these not only for protection against insects, but also for extending the harvest and holding that heat in. And so if we use these, we do want to make sure that we are securing the edges down completely. So we do want to use boards or gravel bags or even dirt, bury the edges. We do need to be mindful of pollination. So we talked about like summer squash. In the normal growing season, if we use these for insect control, whenever they start blooming, we pull it off. We need pollination happening. So we do want to be mindful of what crops we're growing and whether we can keep this in place the entire time, or if we do have to be aware that we need pollinators access to them. We can use things to support them like PVC pipes, wire hoops, wooden frames. Because these are going to be in place for quite a while, I do think it's beneficial to have some support with them. If this is just temporary, where we're just putting it on, trying to squeak some plants past through that first frost, that way, then we can kind of get by with something more temporary as far as support. We don't like the covers to be in contact with leaf material, for instance, because we can get cold damage even underneath these if there's direct contact. Because essentially the heat is drawn out of the leaf by the air. And so we still see damage if there is direct contact. but it's simple and easy if we're just using these short term, but maybe poke some sticks in the ground that hold it up above versus having something a little bit more elaborate or more long lasting like hoops. But certainly floating row covers are useful. We can pull these up during the day. We can leave them down during the day, just depending on the crops we're talking about. So these can really help us nurse a crop later in the season than we might otherwise be able to. We do need to be aware of insect control and problems in the fall garden. Although I think as a general rule, we typically see a little bit less insect pressure, particularly, they are still out there. So last year on one of our school gardens, we definitely had some cabbage worms on our cabbage. So the white butterflies fluttering around, those are the moth that is definitely laying those eggs for the cabbage worms. There's a few different varieties of them. BT or Bacillus thuringiensis products work well. One brand name is Dipel. There are also others out there. You do need to do a good job of applying it. The cabbage worm, that caterpillar, has to eat it. And so if you think of where we find cabbage worms, they are inside the whorl of plants. They are on the underside of leaves. And so that's where we want to concentrate our spraying. We don't just want to spray the top surface of the leaf because that's really not where they do most of their feeding. Most of their feeding is from the bottom. It does work well. It can be beneficial to add something like insecticidal soap as a sticking agent to help it spread and stick better, particularly on some of our brassicas that are very waxy. But just be aware, simply because we have a fall garden doesn't mean we can't have pest problems. We certainly will. And again, floating row covers can be used to exclude those pests. I like having pollinator plantings in gardens or nearby. I think it adds to the aesthetics, but also adds a place of refuge that maybe we aren't spraying. So, certainly the judicious use of insecticides is good in the garden, but it's good to have some areas that maybe we're not spraying. So we have as low impact as possible on our beneficial species, but there's a caveat to refuge and pollinator plantings that we need to talk about. One of those is sometimes our beneficial insects are indiscriminate. And so this was from a friend of mine. She's a horticulture agent up in Kentucky. And so this, of course, is a monarch caterpillar. Well, we like monarch caterpillars, even if they do eat our milkweed, right? So we don't want to see them killed. What we have here is actually a wheel bug. It's a native assassin bug. They're big. They're called wheel bug because you see the hump on their thorax there kind of looks like spines or like cogs on a wheel, or a gear. So it's called a wheel bug. A lot of our beneficial insects have this problem. They don't ask us what they're going to eat. And so they sometimes kill indiscriminately from our standpoint. So, it's not uncommon that, a spider or a praying mantis may actually kill a pollinator on us, or in this case, kill a caterpillar that we are purposely planting plants to offer a place to grow. So just be aware of that. Just because we have beneficials doesn't mean they'll always target the insects that we want them to target. And so just be aware of that. The other thing is this is a buckwheat crop that we have in a local garden. It's the Lincoln Park vegetable garden that we do in concert with the Jonesboro Senior Citizen Center. So we have one bed that we had pulled some cool season crops out of. So we planted a buckwheat cover crop. What's great about buckwheat cover crops is they've got flowers. It's a great way to, if you go there any time of day, you'll see a ton of little wasps and different things, hoverflies, many of which are direct predators to things like aphids or other pests in our garden. We're really doing a good job of attracting beneficials. But just like the white butterflies that are actually moths that are laying those cabbage caterpillars, if we think about, well, what do those adult moths eat? Well, they do nectar. And what do these flowers provide? Nectar. And so what I want to tell you is I think that, pollinator plantings and refuges are great. We should do it more in our gardens, but don't think they're only a one-way street. And so we actually have a pink spotted lady beetle there feeding on the pollen of some of the flowers. That's not a negative thing. They also eat tons of aphids and things like that. So that's a good one to see in the top right. But then we also have the two-lined spittlebug there in the bottom right. And so that is an insect that it would be a pest that would cause damage. And so simply because we have a planting for beneficials doesn't mean we're not also going to see some non-beneficial species there. And so the ideal, and I do mean the L on there, that's just not my Appalachian twang. The ideal is that our garden reaches a balance so that we have areas where we can support the beneficial species. And as the problem species rise in number, we have beneficials there to start attacking those, and then the beneficial numbers grow up. But just understand it's not a one-way street. Simply because we plant marigolds next to something in our garden doesn't mean we won't have any pests. And so I don't want to discourage you from planting, pollinator crops in your garden. Just understand the limitation and keep an eye out for pests. And when they reach a number that, they're really causing some damage on crops, that's when we might need to look at some control, whether organic or conventional products, or maybe even pulling a plant out. Sometimes if we have plants infested with insects, just removing it from the garden and preventing it from spreading is a good step in the right direction for us. Certainly, if we do have things happening in our soils, we can look at different control products for that. Borers are sometimes a problem. Of course, a lot of people think of corn earworms, and they're absolutely right, but European corn borer can be a very bad problem on peppers. It actually bores into the stem of peppers, and then your pepper plant snaps off. And so that's not always thought of. But things like squash vine borers obviously can be very devastating to cucurbits. We've got all the sucking insects out there. And again, this is not to go at any length about their control or what to do, but just keep in mind, these pests can still be in our garden with a fall garden. So just be on the lookout. Fertilizing, I mentioned before about doing in-season or mid-season side dressing of nitrogen. This is coming out of one of UT's publications. And so keep in mind that as this fall guard grows, if we are doing things like squash and tomatoes, as they mature, as we start getting some fruit, you do want to look at coming back and doing some additional nitrogen fertility, because we don't want them to be lacking in fertility, because then they're more stressed, and plants that are more stressed are more susceptible to disease and insect. So it's worth looking at doing some mid-season fertilization if appropriate for the plant we're growing. Weed control tips. We can still have weed problems in our fall gardens. Certainly, if we can keep weeds from growing to seed, we're always benefited. When a weed goes to seed, those seeds are not just going to germinate next year, but for years afterwards, because not all the weed seed becomes immediately available for germination. And so sometimes you'll hear the adage, 1 year of weeds, 7 years of weeding. That's conservative, very conservative. There are weed seeds that will last for decades and decades dormant until they're brought up to the surface. This is also why, sometimes it's better not to till. If you're bringing up new weed seeds every time you till, you're not really controlling your weeds by tilling. And that happens very often. So think about that. But keep areas as weed-free as possible. Lots of times we do a great job in the garden, but maybe there's border areas. And so I'm not saying we have to have manicured areas surrounding our garden, but certainly keeping those maintained to some level is better than just allowing them to grow freely. We want to make sure if we're using manures that they are well composted, so we don't have weed seeds brought in within that soil amendment. Again, if we know mulches or soil has weed seeds in it, don't bring it in. Sometimes one of the biggest or best things we can do for our garden as far as weeds go is not start to have the problem, so not bring it into the garden. So certainly we need to be aware of what comes into the garden. I like cover crops, and truthfully, a fall garden can sometimes make it a little challenging on the timing of establishing a cover crop. The reason I like them is all the positive things it does for the soil. It prevents erosion, it adds organic matter, it competes with those winter annual weeds. If we use something that has a legume in the mix, like an Austrian winter pea, we can be adding nitrogen to our soil, so it's free fertilizer. And it works good as a rotation crop. So again, generally these are species that aren't directly related to most of our vegetables. So it can function as a rotation crop and maybe give us a little bit benefit that way as well. But the challenge is a lot of these we'd like to have established maybe late September or even a little bit earlier, depending on the exact species. Winter wheat is pretty forgiving when it comes to use as a cover crop. We can plant it pretty late, but even it, I'd probably like to see it in the ground by middle of October. Same thing with Austrian winter pea. Oftentimes we'll sow the two of those together. But I do like cover crops. I think they do have a place in the home garden. And so if you haven't given that a thought, I'd encourage you to do so. One of the best things about growing your own and growing fall gardens is you can do some oddball things. So if you've never tried kohlrabi in the garden, you ought to. It's another brassica, so it's cousins to cabbage and kale and broccoli and all of those. Looks a little bit different. It's probably more popular in Europe than it is in the US, but certainly a little bit different, something worth trying. Swiss chard is, I think, a superstar of the vegetable garden. It grows when it's cool. It grows when it's warm. It just grows. And so there's a lot of varieties out there. This is one that because of the color of the stems or petioles on those leaves, it's called peppermint. It does not taste like peppermint, but it does look like peppermint. So there's the Bright Light series as well as other colors. There's the old standby, was it Ford Hook? That's the white stems. So it's a lot of colors out there, so you can add some variety, but it's good to use in the kitchen. It's a leafy green, and again, it just grows and grows. It grows all year long. Kale is kind of the superstar of cold weather. Whether you love it or like it, it certainly is something that is worth having in the fall garden. And so, depending on temperatures, that picture there where we see snow-covered kale is not at all an exaggeration. It is extremely winter hardy and can be one of the last things we have lasting in our gardens. So real quickly, and again, you will get this by email if you're joining us on Zoom. The resources for this class basically is just that full list of resources you may have seen before. If you went to one of my other vegetable gardening classes, it's available there at that URL, or you can use a smart device and use the QR code to take you there. And that's going to be a PDF that gives you clickable links to dozens of different publications. So there's everything from pests to, planning to many, many different resources. So I think you'll find that useful if you've not had the chance to look at that before. So lastly, I will ask for questions.